As I told you before, in this semester or in the rest of this semester and the beginning of the next semester, we are going to switch to a new technology, and that is WPF, because this is the standard in our school for desktop development at your final exam. WPF is a technology which is pretty old, established, I would say. It's not old, it's not outdated, but it's established. It's very well known inside the industry. It's used by a lot of companies, and it's a very interesting technology. I have done a lot of work in WPF. I've written 2 books about WPF, in fact. So yeah, I think this technology is pretty interesting. It's maybe not the newest and freshest technology, but as software developers, we don't always have the choice to use the newest and freshest technology that's on the market, because sometimes you invested a lot of time and money into an existing software, and then you have to simply maintain it. Do you know the old saying, legacy software is software that earns money? If you haven't heard this saying, then remember it, because it's very, very true. So WPF software is software that earns money. Now, most of the classes in the school had WPF in prior years. I heard that because of various factors you haven't done any WPF, so we will do a whirlwind tour, a whirlwind intro to WPF today. Okay, so that's our goal. At the end of today's lesson, you know the basics of WPF and you can build simple WPF apps. And in the upcoming weeks, we are going to deepen that knowledge. Good, let's get started. Please fire up Visual Studio 2022 or the latest version that you have. Then please create a new project, as you can see it here, and then you can find WPF application exactly here. And yeah, the rest shouldn't be a big problem. Let's take the WPF app. Today we are going to do a data binding exercise. We are not going to build a specific application with a certain theme, but we are going to build a general, let's say, hello world application, okay? So let's call it WPF data binding. Put it wherever you want, doesn't matter. Go to next. Please use .NET 8. It's really important that we use .NET 8. In this course, we are not going to focus on old technology. You can use WPF in very old .NET Framework applications, and you can use WPF in everything starting with .NET Core 3.1. So in practice, you can choose whatever you want, but for this course, please use .NET 8. We want to use the latest and greatest version here. If my user interface is a little bit laggy today, that has a simple reason. I don't have Visual Studio installed on my laptop. I'm working remotely on my desktop computer at home, so it depends how fast the school Wi-Fi is. That's the only reason why the user interface is a little bit laggy. Why didn't I install WPF on my computer? Well, I want to keep my laptop pretty clean for certain kinds of work, for certain workloads, and Visual Studio is pretty bulky, and I have a strong desktop at home and it can handle WPF and Visual Studio much better than my small laptop. By the way, do you know the technology Tailscale? Ever heard of it? If you want to work remotely on your computer somewhere, Tailscale is really great. It works awesome. So let's take a quick look at the general layout of a WPF application. It's really pretty simple. I'll zoom in a little bit and then let's talk about the basic principles of a WPF application. Essentially, if you fire up a new WPF application, you get 2 important files, the app XAML file and the main window XAML file. The app XAML file contains central resources, like styles, for instance. It can be compared to a certain... Oh, it's flickering a little bit, right? Okay, I hope it will work out. App XAML contains central resources, and App XAML is also responsible for generating the program CS with the main method. So out of App XAML, let's take a look in this App XAML. Out of App XAML, the main program, the main method is generated. Here you see the resources. We are not going to play around with XAML today. In the next weeks, we are definitely going to take a look at it. One important thing you have to note in XAML, that's the startup URI. You see that one? Here it says main window.xaml. So this is the pointer where app.xaml points to the main window file, and here you can change that. If you want to rename the main window, do not forget to change the name of the new main window here, okay? That's an important pointer. Now the main window itself, as you can see, is XML. It's called XAML, XML Application Markup Language. It's an XML dialect which is focused on building user interfaces. So somewhat similar to HTML in Angular. Angular has HTML template language, but here it's more based on XML. There is a very big principle here in WPF, and that's the first thing that you absolutely have to remember. Please try to follow now. Typically, if you have XML, the schema of the XML, so the tags which are allowed, is defined where? Do you know it? There is an XSD standard, which stands for XML Schema Definition Language. In a schema definition, you define the tags. But in XAML, the tags like window and grid and so on are defined by, and now comes the important part, C# classes. So every tag in XAML is in the background a class in the WPF class library. There is a class called window, and you can find it in a namespace delivered by Microsoft. There is a class which is called grid. The class window has a property of name title. The class window has a property of name height. Do you get the idea? The properties, the attributes in XAML are defined by the properties of the classes in C#. So if we fire up the browser here and do a quick search here on the internet and say .NET window class, for instance, then we will find here a class which is called window. And if we take a look at the properties, we will find a property which is called title. And because there is a property which is called title, we have here this property title. If you want to know the properties of grid, it now should be pretty obvious. You simply say .NET grid class, Google for it. This will lead you to the grid class in System Windows Controls. And here you see, this is the grid. It's derived from panel. And if you want to know the different properties of the grid, then you will see here, these are the properties. Got it? So the documentation of XAML is in fact the class hierarchy in .NET. That's one of the core principles of XAML. This is what you absolutely have to understand. Do you want to extend this XAML with your own control? What do you have to do? You simply have to write the class, and immediately if you write the class, this class becomes available in XAML. Got it? Very different from Angular, but on the other hand, a similar concept. Good. That's the first thing. Now, if you would like to run this application, absolutely no problem. Simply click on F5 or click on the play button or run .NET Run in the console, whatever you want to do. That's nothing special. Let's run this application for the first time. It should give us a main window. Everything's good. Now we can put things into this main window. Close it again. We are good. Now let's talk about what we can do inside of this window. There are, at least for now, two fundamentally different, let's say, controls or control types. One are the so-called panels. Sometimes they are called containers. They are responsible for the layout of the control. Do you want to add multiple buttons, one below each other? Use a panel for that. Do you want to have a kind of grid layout where you arrange maybe a data grid and an input field somewhere? Use a grid. Do you want to, I don't know, implement a card game where you create a fan of cards? Implement your own panel. You can do that. This is called a panel. And if we take a look at the grid again, I have the class still here, you will already see that this says that grid is derived from a base class which is called panel. If you want to know which panels exist, simply take a look at the base class panel, scroll down a little bit, and here you see all the different panels which are available in WPF. There is a canvas, a dock panel, a grid, a ribbon, a stack panel, a virtualizing panel, and a rep panel. For some of them, you will probably immediately, you can guess what they do. What does a stack panel do? Well, it stacks the element. What does a rep panel do? Well, it takes all the elements, puts them side by side until it reaches the end, and then it wraps to the next line. Similar to simple text. What a grid does, it's also pretty obvious. What a dock panel does, it's also pretty obvious, right? It can dock things on the top, on the left, on the right, on the bottom. What does a canvas do? You can work with absolute positions in a canvas. Get the idea? So the panel is not really visible for you. Its only job is to align the items properly. Let's take a look. Let's take a look, and we are going to use primarily two panels. That's a stack panel and the grid. Change the grid to a stack panel. By the way, IntelliSense works really well in Visual Studio and XAML. So if you press lower than sign, you will immediately get a list of classes, which are the XAML tags here, and it works really, really good. That's the advantage of using an established technology. It has been polished for years. The developer productivity tools in Visual Studio for XAML are really, really good. Much better than comparable technologies which are younger. Okay? Good. Let's simply put a button here. Let's play a little bit here and say hello, something like this. And here in the background, here up here, you have a window where you see what you just changed. Okay? We are not, and I forbid that in this course. We are not doing drag and drop development. We are writing XAML by hand. But what we have up here is what you type is what you see. So it's not WYSIWYG, but it's what you type is what you see. You type the code down here and you can check the result up here immediately. You do not need to run the application to see the changes. That is somewhat useful. Okay? So let's take this button and duplicate it a few times. So here I will simply add a bunch of buttons, and now you see what the stack panel does. Got it? Stack panel buttons are one below each other. And if we change the orientation, for instance, here, and we say, hey, make this horizontal, then, well, I need to zoom out a little bit, then we have the buttons, and they are no longer from top to bottom, but they are from left to right. That is one of the most important advantages of XAML and WPF compared to Angular and CSS. CSS is awesome, but working with a grid is not that simple. I mean, CSS grid is really, really, really good, but building grids in WPF is really a nice thing. On the other hand, if you want to build responsive apps in WPF, that's really hard. CSS is much better in that regard. Okay, so you got the idea of a stack panel, and good. Yeah, question?
How would you copy the buttons downwards?
Control Z and Control V, clipboard. Got it?
Really? That fast?
Absolutely. You do not need to mark. Maybe this is what you don't know. If you do not mark text, but you simply have the cursor in a line, and if you press Control Z, it copies the entire line. Control Z, Control V duplicates the line in this case. This is what I did. I pressed Control Z once, and then I pressed Control V a few times. Got it? Good. Nice. Now, of course, we can use panels in panels. So if we put a stack panel here inside of a stack panel, and we put another round of buttons here, hello world for instance, and we copy this one too a few times, then you will see what's going to happen. The first stack panel orients everything from left to right, and the third element is again a panel, and this panel arranges the button from top to bottom. Got it? Works pretty nicely, right? Well, it's really really nice to work with. Okay, of course there are not only buttons, so let's get rid of all these buttons. There are other things too. Particularly interesting for our course here is of course the text block. The text block has a text property, blah blah blah, and it allows us to put text here. Well, I will remove the orientation here, so we have it one below each other. It's a little bit simpler to see. So this is a text block. I don't think that I need to describe anything further here, right? We have a text box. And yeah, we can also say text hello, and the difference is the text box is changeable. So I can click on the text box and I can change something. I can enter something here. There are properties like visibility, for instance, here, where you can hide something like this. Now it's there, but it's hidden. Yeah. And a lot of other properties which we will discover later on, or you will use your favorite AI tool or your favorite search engine to find more details about it. Now we have the button, we have the text block, we have the text box. What else do we have? Well, we have a list box. And inside of this list box, we can then put, for instance, I don't know, some text blocks. So we can copy that one, and we can put some of them here. And let's run this so that we see what I can show you here. Now we have a WPF app with a stack panel and an edit box. Here you see it. Let me zoom in a little bit so you can see it better. Okay, so you see I can change that one. I'm sorry for the flickering here, but I think you get the idea. You can try it on your own. This is the list box. I can simply select one of them. Okay, good. Let's zoom out so the flickering is off. So this is a list box. You will probably use the list box pretty frequently. There are other possibilities too. For instance, there is a data grid. Data grid is very, very useful when it comes to displaying data. It contains a header, and then it can display a list of records. You can simply bind a POCO, a plain old CLR object, to a data grid, and it will automatically put all the properties in columns and display all the properties in a list, for instance. Yeah, you can make it editable, you can make it read-only, whatever you want to do. So that is a data grid. Good? So I think with that we are pretty well equipped to do a little bit more in terms of data binding. Well, we will do that after the break. But one last thing that I wanted to show you, here in the button, if you want to react on something, you simply take a look for the click event handler. You press enter, and then Visual Studio offers you to create a new event handler for you. Simply click on new event handler, and then it creates an event handler for you. You can press F12, go to definition, and that brings you to the C# file, which is the code file behind the window. So here in this button click, you can, for instance, say messagebox.show something like hello world, for instance. Yeah, that looks good. And if we run this guy, then we have a button. We can click on this button and it will say hello world. That is pretty simple, nothing complicated. So this is how you do an event on a button. There are more professional ways than adding a click handler. You can do that with so-called command bindings. I will show you that in the upcoming weeks. So what have we learned so far in 20 minutes? How to create a WPF app. We have learned that there are XAML files, and XAML files consist of C# classes. We have learned that there are panels like stack panel, grid, dot panel, canvas, and so on. We have learned that there are buttons, text blocks, text box, list boxes, and so on. And if you want to know more about all these things, I already told you, take your favorite search engine, look for the button class in WPF, for instance, that will bring you to System Windows Controls button class. Then you can take a look, what is this? This is a button base. If you want to know what the button bases are, simply click on it and take a look what you have. And here you see you have a button, you have a toggle button, you have a repeat button, something like this. If you want to know what toggle buttons are, simply click on it and then you see, aha, a checkbox is in fact a button. A radio button is in fact a button with special capabilities. Got it? So the class hierarchy defines what's possible in WPF. Okay? Good, very good. So now we have a longer break, and after this break we are going to continue and take a look at data binding in WPF. Good. Okay, welcome back from the break. Let's get started. Before the break, we discussed the basics of XAML. I showed you some panels, I showed you some controls, and now I would like to show you how to do data binding. Let's get started. Let's start with the very basics, okay? So if we go into the C# file, which is the backing file of our XAML file, we will find that we have a main window with a constructor that calls initialize component. Initialize component will effectively load the XAML file and create the required objects in memory representing the window. Now, if we want to do data binding, we have to tell the window or the control where to find the properties against which we want to bind. And therefore, we have to specify one very important thing that you absolutely need to remember. That is, we have to set the data context. Let me show you what I mean. We can here say data context equals to, and then we can essentially define any object. So if we want to keep it very simple, we could say, let's create an anonymous class here and set a name, which is John Doe, as you can see it here. That's just an object without a class. It's very, very simple. So if I save this thing, go into the XAML file, and take, for instance, the first text block, then I can use a so-called markup extension, which starts with curly braces. Then I can see binding, then I can see path, and then I'm going to use first, did I call it first name or did I call it name? It's just, I call it just name. You see, the important thing here is that this path, listen closely, that's important, is always relative to the data context. We can tell the system bind to the name because our data context contains a name property. However, it will not work like that because that is a field. We can only bind against properties. Got it? So this is not a good idea if you run this code. Let's make it a little bit more beautiful. We can create, for instance, a record. We simply say record person with a string name, something like this. And then let's change the code up here, and we will simply say that data context is a new person, and that will be John Doe. Now it's much better because, as we know, records, they create properties, not fields. We can do it like that. It is not perfect. We will make it perfect a little bit later, but for now it should work. Let's try it. Let's run it. And you see here, John Doe. Data binding worked. Give it a try. I'll show it to you again. The XAML file has these curly braces. It's a so-called markup extension. Then we say binding. By the way, as everything in XAML, binding is a class. And then we specify path equals name. And name works because we have a data context. And inside of this data context, we have an object with a property called name. Okay, if you understood that one, let me change that code a little bit. I will remove the record again. I will create a property directly in my main window, call it string name, and then I'm going to write data context equal this. Maybe let's say John Doe here. Question, will this still work? Let's try it. Let's press F5. I mistyped John Doe. Doesn't work. Because I called it name. Let's call it person name, okay? Name is a reserved property here. Sorry. I wanted to demonstrate that it works, not that it doesn't work. It was my mistake. Now it works. Sorry for my mistake here. I forgot that name is a property. Of course, it's kind of obvious. The important thing is that data context equal this means that the window itself becomes the data context. And therefore, the path here, this one, is relative to the data context. Therefore, it looks in the main window. Does this work on your computers? Does anybody have problems with this data binding expression? This is an absolute minimum. This is something that you have to remember in order to survive the next exam and in order to survive your final exam, your Matura. Absolutely, you have to remember these bindings. These bindings will be very important. So now let's try something in the button click method. If I change the person name in the button click method, let's do that. Let's say person name plus equals, let's just add an exclamation mark, okay? I think that is fine. And let's also set a breakpoint here. I'm going to set a breakpoint here in this line so we see whether this method is really called. So let's press run or debug in this case. Let's click on the button hello, click. The method handler is called. I will add the exclamation mark to person name. Let's continue with the debugging. Let's take a look in the window and the name is not updated. See? But it definitely changed inside of our C# code. So if I press again, I can prove to you that the person now has an exclamation mark on it. Oh, it's only hard to see here, but you see the exclamation mark. So it really, really worked. So what's the problem here? You have to understand that in contrast to Angular, WPF does not automatically recognize changes in properties. WPF is not sitting there constantly monitoring the properties, asking the window, hey, did you change? Did you change? Did you change? Did something change? Angular does that. We talked about that last year, and I told you exactly how in Angular that worked. But in WPF, this is not done. This is kind of inconvenient, but it is like it is. We have to deal with it. Now, how can we tell the view layer that a property has changed? That's the next thing that you absolutely need to remember. There is an interface which is called iNotifyPropertyChanged. And you see, my GitHub Copilot immediately recognized that this is probably what I want to do. So let's accept the iNotifyPropertyChanged here. You absolutely have to remember this interface. If you do an oral exam here with me, I ask you questions, I will probably ask you what is iNotifyPropertyChanged. You have to remember that. Now, what does this iNotifyPropertyChanged do? Let's implement. First, let's add the using so it knows what the property is, and then let's implement the interface. The only thing that this interface contains is an event handler which is called propertyChanged. So whenever our data context wants to tell the view, hey, something has changed, it needs to fire this event. It needs to say, property changed, and the view will automatically respond to this event. The view, WPF, knows iNotifyPropertyChanged, and it simply subscribes to the event. Got it? That is the same in other platforms like, for instance, Avalonia. That's the same in WinForms. So all these desktop application platforms, they have some kind of notification mechanism. So let's try that. Let's try to fire the event once the person changed. Now, as you can see, my GitHub Copilot immediately knows what we have to do, and I simply have to accept the change. It tells us property changed, question mark dot simply means if somebody is interested, then call the invoke, then invoke the event. The question mark dot is important here because if nobody is interested in the event, it shouldn't be invoked. And as a parameter, we have to tell the system here new property changed event args. Because we are in a new version of C#, we can simply get rid of the name of this complicated class. We can simply say new. And then we have to tell WPF which property has changed. And in our case, as you can see it here, the person name has changed. Let's try it again. Let's run this guy. F5 or play button. Press hello, and we see we get an exclamation mark. I can press it a lot of times, and you will see that more and more and more exclamation marks are added to the person name. That is exactly what I wanted you to see. Please try it. Yes, well, question.
What does the name of do?
What does the name of do? Very good question. What you see here is exactly the same as if I would write this. Oh, sorry. Yes, it's exactly the same. But you shouldn't use the so-called magic string, because if I rename this thing up there, so if I press F2 to rename, or that's Control RR here in Visual Studio, if I rename that to person name 2, then you see if it's a string, it's not automatically renamed. But if I use the name of operator here, then if I go here, press RR, change that to 2, then this is automatically refactored to. So it's not a good style to add a constant string, a so-called magic string. You should use the name of operator here. So we know a button. We know how to do the data binding. I think we are ready to go. Well, nearly. Let's take a look at the XAML file. Let's restructure that a little bit. Now we have a button, we have a text block, and I want to get rid of everything. The only thing that I want to have inside of my XAML file is this list box. See this list box here? So I have a button, I have a text block, and I have a list box. Looks good. Now let's go into the C# file and let's create a list of something. Public string array, greetings, and that will be get and set, and yep, that sounds good. And because we are now in .NET 8, we can simplify the collection initialization to the new syntax that we got with C#8, which is just the square brackets here. Hello, hi, hey. Okay, so now we have 3 strings. The question is, how can we add these strings to the list box? In former times, when I was young, when I was at your age, I would need to write the for loop and call the insert method on the list box, but nobody does that anymore. That's really outdated. If you remember, how is it done in Angular? You had this ng4 thing, right? In XAML it works a little bit different. What we have to do is we have to again use a binding, but this time we are not going to bind to the text property, but here we have an items source property. I think the name is pretty self-explanatory, right? Items source. What is the source of the items? And there we can simply again use a binding, say path, and then we can take a look. What is the name of the property? The name of the property is greetings, right? So we simply add path equals greetings here. And if I run this thing, we will see that we have in our list box 3 elements, 3 names. Perfect. By the way, this path equals to can be left out. You do not need this. If you just have the path, you can simply write binding greetings. It's a little bit shorter, it's a little bit more concise. Write path equals or not path equal, it depends, whatever you want to do. It's really up to you. Does it work for everybody? Yep. Okay, good. In our button, we are now going to add a greeting. In order to be able to change the greetings, let's switch from a string array to a list of string. Please change it to a list of string so that we can go here in the button click and simply add a greeting. So I will say greetings.add hola. Yeah, I think that is fine. Let's give it a try. What do you think? Does it work? Doesn't it work? Well, the answer is simple. It doesn't work. If I click hello, the exclamation marks are added, but we do not get additional fields here or additional options in the list box. You see it? We have one possibility. We can try to invoke the property changed event again. Any questions? Any problems? Doesn't it? It shouldn't work. Yeah? I will show you the XAML file again. Item source equals to whatever. Got it? Good. Now, what I can do, I can try to call the property changed event. Let's give it a try. See? I'm simply calling property changed greetings. Let's see if that works. Click, 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 click. Doesn't work, right? So this is not the correct approach. This is not the correct approach for a list. The reason is that there is a second interface beside iNotify property changed. And this second interface is called iNotify collection changed. We do not need to implement the iNotify collection changed, because this is something that the collection needs to implement. But now comes the important part, and this is the thing that you absolutely have to remember. Never use a list when working with WPF. Always use an observable collection. This is what you should use. Observable collection. If we take a look at an observable collection, then you will see that this supports iNotify collection changed out of the box. You do not need to do anything. It just solves all your problems for you. Then you can get rid of this invoke down here, and you can simply, without any hesitations, call the add method and it will magically work. Let me show you, let me prove to you that this really works. Click, 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 works. Now I can select here in the list box exactly as I expected. Please try it. And I don't know how you do it, but you have to memorize iNotify property changed and observable collection. I will tell you that over and over and over again until you can't hear it anymore. Try it. Okay, good. Now that we have talked about observable collection, I would like to make our example a little bit more complicated. What I want to do is I want to add an additional text block below the list box. Text block. And inside of this text block, I want to have, listen closely, I want to have the selected item inside of the list box. Got it? I want to have the selected item inside of the list box. Now, how can we do that? What we are going to do is we are going to create a second property here in our C# file, and this property will be called string selected greeting. Now we can go into the XAML, and here in the list box we can say bind selected item to binding selected greeting. Got it? So the list box will bind the currently selected element to our property. That is now a binding that works in the other direction. So far we created properties in C# and bound them to the user interface. Now we are binding a user interface interaction, a selection changed, and we are binding it back into C#. And of course, we can do multiple bindings for the same property. In text block, we can say text equals to, and probably you can guess what I'm going to write here. I'm simply going to say selected greeting. So this should enable us to see the currently selected greeting directly under the list box. Let's give it a try. And click, click. That still works. Click on the hi. We don't see anything. Click on the hey, we don't see anything. Click on the hello, we don't see anything. It seems that selected item doesn't work. Why? You already know the answer. Can you guess it? Exactly that is what we have to do. Once selected greeting changes, we have to notify WPF that a change happened. So unfortunately, we cannot write a simplified property like that. Let me show you how we can implement that. We can say private string, I will call it selected greeting value. And that will be simply a field. It is not a property. Then in selected greeting, here we have a getter and we have a setter. The getter is pretty obvious, selected greeting value. The setter is a two-liner. We are going to say selected greeting value equals value, and then we are going to call property changed with the invoke here. Now listen closely, that's an important one. In practice, nobody ever writes that code. Of course, in practice, you have frameworks, libraries, tools which can generate this code for you, or at least give you helper functions to make it simpler. But in this course, I want to show you what's going on behind the scenes. It's not my job to discuss 15 different MVVM frameworks with you. That is something you will find out later on when you work in practice. I want to give you a solid foundation so you understand what's going on. Okay? So don't get a wrong impression. This WPF code is not the WPF code that is written outside in the wild. There, frameworks are used. If you want to know more about that, please ask me. But for now, it's perfectly fine for our course. So let's run this thing. Click on it. And you see, works properly. Everything works very nicely. We can select whatever we want. It works perfectly fine. Please take the time to try that. And please try to really understand what we just did here. It's important. I have it on video. You can rewatch it. I know it will be a very quick introduction today, but this is what we have the recording for. The next step in our data binding journey is that we are going to discover how we can fill something that is more interesting than a list box. So let's change our greeting stuff from a string to something which is more interesting, okay? Let's create a class, a second class. What do you want to maintain here? Should we maintain superheroes or movies, or what do you want to maintain? Let's say teachers. Why not teachers? Let's maintain teachers. That is just a teacher. And we are going to add a property here, which of course is the name and the subject, and I will make your life very hard. So we are going to add niceness. Is this a word? Can we say that? I'm not sure. Let's just say nice, okay? We are only working with fictitious teachers here, okay? No real teachers are going to be named. So yeah, let's add default values here, and the nice factor is by default, of course, all teachers are nice. Good. Now let's change the collection from an observable collection of string to an observable collection of teacher. Let's rename the greetings to teachers. Good. And let's add 1 or 2 teachers here. I guess that GitHub Copilot will be able to help me. Yep. Good. Come on. I forgot the public here. I'm sorry. The class teacher must be public because our main window is also public. So now we already have a little bit more interesting data. The only thing here is we need to say teachers, and we need to add another teacher so that it works. Shouldn't be a problem. GitHub Copilot will do that hopefully for me. Come on, GitHub Copilot, give me something. I don't want to type it. One gets lazy once we have GitHub Copilot, right? That's foo, and the subject is bar, and the nice factor is 1 in this case. It's just demo. Okay, looks good. So let's try that. I consciously made a mistake now. Okay, I didn't change the WPF XAML. So if I run this thing, you see, nothing is displayed. What's the problem? I mean, why didn't we have an exception or something like this? It's very important that you understand that if you have something like this, if data binding simply doesn't work, it's super important that you check the output window. Just like I told you over and over again with Angular, that it's important that you take a look at the console. In WPF, there is no console, but there is this output window, which is currently not highlighted, but I think you recognized it. And inside the output window, we have a binding expression path error greetings property not found on object main window. Do you see the mistake? Do you see the error? I made this error consciously, okay? So this was not an error of my side. I consciously made this mistake. So what we now have to change here, we have to change that to teachers. Okay? And of course, the selected greeting is also wrong, because now we don't have a selected greeting, but we have a selected teacher. Selected teacher. We have a selected teacher value. Also here we have a selected teacher value. Also here we have a selected teacher value. And also here we have a selected teacher. It is no longer a string, but it is a teacher. And here it is also a teacher. Now we should be much better. The XAML here should now be the selected teacher. The text block should be the selected teacher, and I think with that we can try it. Let's see. Okay, it is not perfect. We can add something, as you can see it here, but the list box does not display the name and the subject and the nice factor, but it simply displays the name of the object, the name of the class here. So it's just teacher. So that's not perfect. This was now a little bit of refactoring, so please take the time to also do all the changes on your side. Okay, so what can we do in order to make that a little bit more useful? Now what we can do first, we can change this one, the text block.text. We can change that one to selected teacher.name. So we can use a dot syntax if we want to navigate within an object. See? The selected teacher gives us a teacher and the teacher gives us the name. Got it? This is useful. And the second thing that we can do here in the list box, we have a very useful property which is display member path. And there we can simply say name. Display member path is relative to the object because the teacher has a name we can say display the name in the list box. So if I run this guy, you will see that we now have the name. And if I select John Doe, the name is also displayed below the list box. Got it? So for the list box, the display member name member path property is really, really useful when you have an object behind the data binding, not just a string or a number. Does it work properly? Awesome. But this is still not perfect. We want to make it a little bit more interesting, so please get rid of the display member path again and change the list box to a data grid. And then let's simply run it again. And see what we have here? Now we have a data grid, and we can select in the data grid. We have columns, we can make them larger, we can rearrange them. We already have a data grid. We can even sort the data by clicking on the headers. Isn't that nice? However, the data grid is editable, so I could already manipulate the data, as you can see it here, but we get an exception, as you can see here, because, yeah, something doesn't work. Editing inside of the grid needs additional work, and we are not going to do that today, okay? So we need to somehow make this data grid read-only. We don't want to have an editable grid, but generally it worked pretty nicely. If you want to make it read-only, you can simply say, is read-only true? And then the data grid is no longer editable, and this is perfect for our needs here. See, now it is no longer editable. I cannot double-click the element, and with the selected item, everything still works very nicely. Okay, next. What you have probably seen is that it's very inconvenient that when writing bindings, we do not get IntelliSense. Did you see that? So if I, for instance, start to type here, binding blank, and I say TE, it would be very nice if we have IntelliSense. Now I have IntelliSense. How did I do that? Well, you can add one magic line to your window on top here. It says d:\data context, design instance, type, and then you add the type which you use as your data context. So in this case, I'm telling WPF that my data context, can you remember the data context was this guy here, that the type that I use as the data context is my main window. I'm going to tell WPF that it shouldn't create an instance while I work on the code. It should just take the metadata, name of the properties and so on. And if you add this magic line to your WPF XAML, then you suddenly get IntelliSense. You see, text block binding, selected, and I have my teacher dot, and I get IntelliSense name. I cannot mistype it. Okay? So please remember that line. Don't worry. At the exam, at the final exam, at the Matura, you do not need to know that by heart. This will already be in your existing starter code. Okay? You do at the final exam, you will not have internet access, and you do not need to learn these things by heart, because in practice you would look it up like I did before this lesson. Good? This makes our life much easier if we do it like that. Very good. So now we have 5 minutes left. The question is what we do. Yeah, question. False. If you create true, let me show you what's going to happen if we create true. In this case, I think we can set it to true. Let's see. Let's save it here. And I'm not sure if it works or not. Let's see. In this case, it doesn't make a difference. Yeah, it does make a difference. Yeah, very good, very good. So what I did now is I said, is design time creatable true? do you see what's happening up here where we have this what you write this what you see? Suddenly you have a view that is filled with data inside the designer. Where does this data come from? Answer: the Visual Studio development environment will create an instance of your main window and will really do the data binding inside of your designer. Got it? And if you say, is design time creatable false, it will, you see it here, it will remove the data and it will only use IntelliSense metadata reflection of your code. But did I answer your question? Good. So sometimes it's possible, but think of a solution where your data context is accessing a database, and maybe during development you do not have access to the database. Then you would definitely say, is design time creatable false, because you cannot access the database. Got it? Okay. So I will not add anything else here, but I would like to give you a homework.